everyone, this is JBJ and welcome to the CakePHP 3 tutorial part 4 about authentication. In the previous video, we implemented searching through bookmarks so that when we amassed a huge collection of bookmarks, we could search through them. Now, while we implemented this feature, we made a lot of different stuff. For instance, we made a custom find method so that we could find bookmarks with a certain tag. We also implemented a new view and we implemented a new route. In this video, we will be implementing authentication to our application so that the bookmarks will be registered to a certain user. Now in the table they are already registered to a certain user, but right now we don't have like a login and logout feature, and that's what we're going to be implementing. We will implement both the login and the logout feature in this video. So let's get to it. Now this is the bookmarks application, and what we need to do is list our users, and we need to verify that we have a user with a hashed password. Now if you don't have this, create a new user like I'm doing now. I'll just call mine video at test, and the password will just be ABC123. So I submit this one, and I can see now in the users table that the video test user has been created and has a hashed password. Now you need this information or else you won't be able to actually use the login feature, which we will implement right now. So this is our bookmarks controller, as we can see right here, and what we implemented in the previous video was this tags method. Now in this video we'll be implementing a authentication layer, and to do that we're going to use something called a component. Now a component in CakePHP is, to quote from their documentation, it is a reusable chunk of controller code related to a specific feature or concept. Now this makes the login feature a component because the login procedure will have to be shared between controllers, because we need to authenticate the user between each controller to make sure he's still logged in when we go from one controller to the other. So a component is how we do it in CakePHP. And CakePHP already has something, and that's called the auth component. And in order to add the auth component to our project, we will go into the app controller. Now the app controller is like the master controller in our application. If we look in the bookmarks controller, it extends the app controller. If we look in the pages controller, it extends the app controller. So the app controller is the highest controller in our hierarchy right now. So everything goes through the app controller. So if we implement authentication in the app controller, every controller that inherits or extends from the app controller will have authentication in it. We could just implement it in the bookmark controller, but then only the bookmarks method and views would have authentication, whereas the others like the tags and the users would not. So we implement it in the app controller. And in order to do it, we need to do something in the initialize method. Now, they call this an initialization hook method. And hook method are just like, they're ways to hook on to a certain event happening in CakePHP. And it says we need to use this method to add common initialization code like loading components. Okay, we need to load a component. We need to load the auth component, so this is the logical place to do it. Great. So I'm just going to clear it out so we have nothing. We just have an empty initialize function right now. And the first thing we're going to do is say this load components, and we're going to load up flash like that. We are also going to load in another component, and that's called auth. Now this is the authentication component, and the first parameter is just the name of the component, and the next one is an array. Let's see if we can, there we go. And as an index, we're going to have authenticate. It's going to use an array here, then form, and then another array, then fields, and then another array, then username, email, and password as password. There we go. Then we close that one off. Then right here, we will add another key to the original array called login action. It takes an array, and then the controller will be users, and the action will be login. Now, this might seem like a complicated structure, and everything is done in array here, as you see. And that's kind of like something that CakePHP just does. They do a lot of things in arrays. Now, CakePHP 3 has moved on to be a lot more object-oriented, but we still have a lot of array functionality like this one. But it's not so bad because it's actually very readable. Now, what we have done so far is load in two components, the Flash component, which was pretty simple, and then we've loaded in the Auth component. Now, the Auth component was a little bit bigger, and that's because we've customized it, and that's this extra optional parameter, which is like an options array. And then we have like an authenticate key here, and that's also an array. Then we have a form, which basically means that this is our login form, authentication form. Then we define the fields, and the fields for the username is an email. So that means that the username is not a username like any name. It has to be an email. And the password, well, that's just a password. Now, on the second index, we have a login action key, and that's exactly what it sounds like. It's the action to go to when you need to log in, and it exists in the users controller, and the action is called login. Okay, so we have defined the login fields, and we have defined where to go when we need to log in. Okay, so let's just try and fire this up in our browser and see if this does anything. Okay, here I have the application, and I'm gonna try to refresh the browser now. Oh, and now we get an error. Okay, missing method in users controller. The action login is not defined in the users controller. Okay, so we know for a fact right now that it tries to verify us and determines that we are not logged in, and then tries to redirect us to the login action defined in the users controller. We have not implemented this login view yet, so that's what we're going to do next. So I'm going to fire up my users controller now. We can also see the users controller also extends the app controller. And we are going to create a new function in here. And remember, that's how CakePHP handles things. Now, get ready for another important lesson called the CakePHP request cycle. The CakePHP request cycle is basically what happens whenever you try to access something in CakePHP, like you request a page, and then CakePHP will do a lot of stuff. For instance, it'll check your routes and see which controller action to call based on your URL. Then it will go to that controller method and do whatever setup is defined in there, and then it will present the view that has the same name as the method. So that's basically how everything relates. So you have an URL, you have a controller method, and you have a view. And that's what we have here as well. We have a controller, the users controller. We have a method, public function, and it's called login, because that's what we defined in the app controller to go to the users controller and the login action. And obviously the error was that we haven't implemented this one yet. And the first thing we'll do is we'll check and see if this request is a post. If it's a post, we'll make a user variable where we say this auth identify. Then we see if a user was identified and found. And then we say this auth set user to be the user. And then we return a redirect to this auth redirect URL. There we go. And if we get down here, that means the user could not be identified. And we'll say this flash an error. Your username or password is incorrect. There we go. Okay, so now we have implemented the method. First we'll check to see if it's a post. And it's not necessary to do, but I like to do it because it's an extra form of security to verify that you got to the login page through a post and you didn't just type it into your URL. You were actually redirected to this page through the auth component. And then we create a user variable and we call the identified method on the auth component. Now it'll return the user if it could be identified. And if the user could be identified, we set the user to be this user and then we return the redirect URL. And if none of this happens, or well basically if this doesn't happen, we'll get to this area, and that means we couldn't identify the user, and then we flash an error. And remember, flash was the other component that we imported, or that we loaded here. And the reason that we actually use a post is, as I said, it's like an extra form of security, but it also means, or will most likely mean, that a user tried to log in. They submitted the form to the auth component. So that means that this is a login request. It's not like just the viewing of the login page. It's actually the login process. Someone typed their credentials into the fields and submitted the form, making it a post request. So that when you just view the page, like if you go to the login page, you have a login button on your website, you wouldn't trigger this, you would just show the form. So that's what that does. Now next we're going to implement the view itself. Now remember, this is the action, this is the method in the controller that will be called whenever we get to this URL. So this login action, it needs a login view in order to present whatever has to happen after this code is run. And we're going to go into the template folder down here, then into the users. Then we are going to add a new file. Just going to call it login.ctp, and remember, this .ctp is just all view files. This is just a simple login form. So we say this form create. Now this is something called a form helper, and that it helps us create forms. Whoops. Just going to do this. So we create a form. Then we make an input field called email. Then we make another input field. It's called password. Whoops. Then we make a button called login. And then we close the form. Now, you could have wrote this form like with plain old HTML, but here we have used the CakePHP way. Now, the Cake way of doing things is to use this form class, this form helper. And the first line here will just create the form. That's the equivalent of doing, this form role equals form, method equals post, and yada yada yada, so on. That's the equivalent of doing that. And now the others are just input fields, and then we have the submit button, and then we close the form off, just like writing form like that. So by doing it the Cake way, we get a lot of extra features, especially when we work with database entities. So I really do recommend that you just use the Cake way of doing things, because even though sometimes you won't get that much out of it, but then again, other times you gain so much, like authentication, error handling, and inserting stuff into the database and so on. I mean, you get a lot of different free features if you just use the form. There's really not a reason not to, or very rarely a reason not to. So you really have to think about it if you choose not to use it. Okay, so now we have a simple login form, and let's try and fire it up in the browser. Okay, so here the application is, and the last time we were told that the login action was not defined, and we can also see here at the URL it's actually trying to use the users controller and the login action. So if we just try to go to this site once again, then boom, we have a login form. Now remember, because we checked to see if it was a post before we wrote the actual code to log in, it is not triggered now. Like these are GET requests. So the very first if statement in our code is false, and thus no code is actually run in the controller. So then we go straight to the view and just gets presented this. Now it already has filled out my credentials for this video user I made, but let's just try and misspell something and then try to log in. And whoops, your username or password is incorrect. Now, do you remember what this is? It's another component that we loaded, and it's a Flash component. Now we can use the Flash component to display messages to the user. Now this is an error message. You can see it has like the error styling, and it's a very powerful way of, and a very easy way to display messages to the user, like in this case. So whenever they try to log in, we authenticate, and then we'll just, when they press this button, it'll call the same login method. And since this is now a post, we try to identify the user, we fail, and remember all this identification and authentication of the user by looking in the database, verifying the hashed passwords and so on, that's all handled automatically by Cake, because we used the Cake way of doing things all the way through, all the way from making the users table and all the way to creating the users login form. And that's one of the great things about Cake. You get this functionality for freaking free. Yes, sir. All right. Now, we try to log in with the real user. We go into the login method, it authenticates us, and then it redirects us. And it'll redirect us to the users page. And that's what is defined as the redirect URL on the auth component, because like with the users, so well we go here. And now we are, well, basically at the very first site we tried to access. Okay, so great, now we can log in. Let's implement the logout feature. In order to log out, we're going to go into the users controller right there, and we're going to implement a logout method. This is public function logout, and all that's going to do is simply flash a message using the Flash component. This is a success message. You are now logged out. And then we're going to return a redirect to the logout method of the auth component. And that's it. If we fire up this in the browser, we will simply log out just by redirecting, and in the redirect we call the logout of our authentication, and that'll return what we actually will have to redirect to. And let's just try and fire it up in the browser and see how it behaves. Okay, so here we are logged in right now, so we can list the bookmarks and we can do a lot of different stuff. Let's just go back to the users. Now, right now I'm just in the users controller, and if I go into the logout method, and remember the way Cake does things is like it's a controller and then it's the action. This is the application folder name. That's just the directory structure, the server name. And then we have the controller and our logout action. So if you go into this one, it'll say we are now logged out and we're gonna have to log in again. And we can just try to access the bookmarks. And you can see we just get thrown back to the login page. We are logged out. It does not remember us anymore. Then we can log in and oh, notice this. Now we are in the bookmarks. So we are actually in the method that redirected us to the login page. So remember the first time I tried to access the list of users, then I got redirected to the login page. When I logged in, I was presented with the list of users, which was the original page I tried to view. And that's another thing that we get from the auth component when we are using that redirect URL. And now I did it with the bookmarks. I tried to access this page, got thrown to the logout, I logged in, and then I get presented this view because CakePHP knows that this was the view I actually wanted to view. That's great. So that's basically it. Now we can log in, we can log out. And we didn't write a lot of code, but we got a lot of functionality. And that's just how Cake handles it. You know, you don't write a whole bunch of code, but you just get a lot of free stuff. The hard part is, though, to remember the code you actually have to write, because it's a complicated framework. But practice makes perfect, so just implement your own and try to analyze everything you're doing, and I'm sure you'll do just fine. In the next video, we are gonna be looking at registrations, amongst other things. I think we got a few more series videos left in the series, so thanks a lot for watching. Please stay tuned for the next part, and please do remember to like, comment, and or subscribe to my channel. It really helps and I really do appreciate it. So if you like the videos, please do any number of those things to support me. And I'll see you guys next time.